I have so far been mainly autobiographical, giving an account of the kind of assignments I had under government, which varied very considerably over the years. Now I should like to turn to something different, to look at certain events which I had occasion to watch at close quarters or in which I myself had a part to play. I shall begin with Indo-Pak relations in the days of Prime Minister Shastri. Shastriji was extremely anxious to establish good, cordial, friendly relations with Pakistan. The first step he took in this direction was to engineer an artificial technical halt for refueling in Pakistan when he was coming back from the non-aligned summit in Cairo. This halt gave an opportunity for him to have a quiet personal tete-a-tete with President Ayub. At the end of that talk, he came back and he told me it was excellent, very friendly. He did not raise the Kashmir issue once, and we were on a very friendly wicket. Thereafter, there was a press conference jointly addressed by Shastriji and Ayub. Shastriji did the main speaking, but Ayub was sitting by his side so that he could contradict him if he wanted to, but no, it was a perfectly harmonious presentation. But soon after, trouble started over the Rann of Kutch. Now, this came as a great blow and surprise to Shastriji. He was not prepared to compromise on the principle that the territory was ours. And he was prepared to concede that if, according to the Radcliffe Award, the boundary was different from what we claimed it to be and what it had been all these years, he would certainly accept Pakistan's claim, but only on that basis there could be no further transfer of territory as between India and Pakistan, because that would be ceding our territory. He was prepared to look upon it as a boundary dispute but not as a territorial dispute. Now, in the conflict, the Indian army was at a great disadvantage because our troops and materials and equipment had to go over desert without rail links, while Pakistan was extremely well served in all this account. The British Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson, took a hand at trying to resolve the differences. I was the intermediary in the sense that the British High Commissioner John Freeman used to come and see me, and I used to talk to Shastriji. Or, if necessary, we used to have a meeting of the Emergency Committee of the Cabinet, attend Janpath, and take a final view, and the response was passed on. As a result, a simple ceasefire came into existence, but still there was no progress towards settlement of the dispute because there were arguments on both sides. In between, there was the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London, to which Shastriji had to go and to which President Ayub was also coming. Shastriji was in two minds about leaving the country because the conflict had not come to an end. So it was arranged as between me and Mr. Chavan, who was the defense minister, that if a situation arose in which we would have to take action and the conflict would revive, he would send me a message in code, in simple words, which would mean to me something quite different, and Shastriji and I would fly back immediately. At this point of time, Shastriji had also concluded that if the conflict is to continue, then he would not fight only in the Rann of Kutch, where we were handicapped, then it would be an all-out conflict and we would attack Lahore. This decision was put to him by the Army Chief, General Chaudhry, and he said, yes, if necessary, we shall do that. I mean, we can't fight with our hands tied behind our backs. And the question was that if a situation arose in which we had to attack Lahore, then Shastri ji and I would fly back on receipt of a very simple, innocuous message from Mr. Chauhan. In London, Shastri ji met Ayub at the conference and also in the corridors, and I was present at this conversation. President Ayub said to him, Shastri ji, our boys gave your voice a few knocks and you began to squeal. So Shastri ji said, Mr. President, you are a field marshal. I know nothing about military strategy. But do you think that if we wanted to attack Pakistan, we would choose an area in which you had all the logistic advantages and support and we had none? And I could see from President Ayub's face that this point had never occurred to him. And it is my firm conviction that what had been reported to him by maybe Mr. Bhutto or maybe by the army was that it is the Indians who have invaded us in Rann of Kutch and not the other way around. And I could see President Ayub's face react in a way that this point had gone home. And fortunately, thereafter, an agreement to refer the boundary dispute, not territorial dispute, to arbitration was arrived at, and the chapter was closed. But then came the second movement. This was Kashmir. And it was a launching of an attack on Akhnur bridge by tanks by Pakistan, which brought things to a total boil. The only way it could be contained was if we could foil the attack not by using armor against armor, because we did not have the access to those spots through heavy armor, but by using the Air Force. And I must say, to the credit of Air Chief Marshal Arjun Singh, that he said, yes, I shall take them on. And so, contrary to all military and Air Force calculations about the suitability of time, venue and opportunity, he took the task of repelling the armored attack by using aircraft for the purpose. That gave us the breathing space, and eventually we did stage the attack on Lahore, which had been pre-planned in the context of the earlier Rann of Kutch dispute. Anyway, the rest is known history. Eventually there was a ceasefire. UN intervened, and the Secretary General of the UN came to India, and his proposal was that both parties should withdraw to the ceasefire line. Now, Shastri ji had declared, if I remember correctly, in a speech at the Red Fort on 15th August, that we cannot go on withdrawing from positions we take up from Pakistan occupied Kashmir. It's our territory, and our Jawans can't be made to sacrifice their lives and then told to pull back. So having made that announcement, he was quite determined that he won't withdraw from that position which our army had occupied in Kargil and other places. Sardar Swaran Singh, as foreign minister, felt that this is a point where we shall have to yield to the world opinion pressure. The whole UN will be against us if a ceasefire line sanctified by the UN is not respected by us. So he came to see Shastri ji and he said, please, LK, you also come along with me. So we talked to him. And Shastri ji said in a very quiet voice, Sardar Sahab, I think you are right. We shall have to withdraw under world pressure. But I don't think I shall be the Prime Minister of India to put it to the country. With that sentence, the argument ended. We went back. We told U Thant that this is not on, and then there was no way in which progress could be made. Here, as a side story, I must also add that the U Thant proposals appeared in the Indian press as if they had leaked from New York. U Thant was very het up because these proposals had not been formulated in New York. They had been drawn up on the way to India. So he's accused the Indians that you have leaked it out. And I think now that it's past history, I can recall that A.N. Jha, who was the Information Broadcasting Secretary, he told me that under the instructions of Srimati Indira Gandhi, who was the Information Broadcasting Minister, he had leaked it out to the Indian press to say that it should appear under New York Dateline, because she wanted the Indian public opinion to react to Uthan's proposal while he is here, so that he may seize that it's not a Government of India position, but a position which the entire people of India share. So there was this stalemate, a ceasefire, and what next? This time, the Soviet Union, Prime Minister Kosygin began to press Shastriji to come to Tashkent for a conference, to joint conference with President Ayub to resolve the differences. Shastriji kept on saying no. He said, what is the use? After all, they will ask us to withdraw to the ceasefire line, which I am not prepared to do, and so I must say no. So I said that, look, after all, the Russians have been very friendly to us on all Indo-Pak matters. And if we reject their initiative, we shall antagonize them. As it is, the Americans have always been with the Pakistanis. Should we lose the friendship of the Russians also on this issue? He said, what you say is fair enough, but then it will be even worse if I go there and turn down what they propose. Then one day, talking to him, and he used to be walking very often while I talked to him because he wanted to have his exercise, normally in the office room itself. And in fact, if I may remember, it is this very room, which was his office room then, in which he and I were talking. I had, supposing as a result of our pulling back to the ceasefire line, the ceasefire line gets sanctified and recognized as international boundary. Would it not be a final burial of a long-standing dispute? So he stopped in his walking and said, say that again. So I repeated it again. He didn't say anything. He resumed his walking. Obviously, this thought somehow began to appeal to him, that if it means a final end to this long story of fighting over the border, perhaps there is something in it. The next morning he said, you know, you have been saying this. I'm inclined to think that there may be some merit in this approach, but I cannot take it as a purely political approach. I must carry the defense forces with me. And only if the defense forces also are a party to this settlement, if they also look at it this way, then this may be a feasible solution. But I don't want them to be told that this is a settlement which I am prepared to consider, because I don't want to say it to anybody yet. In view of what you have said, I am prepared to think about it. So I am prepared to give a positive response to Kosygin's invitation to come to Tashkent, provided with me comes not only the foreign minister, Sardar Saran Singh, but also the defense minister and the chief of army staff. Muthu Chaudhary was the chief of army staff. He said that his going away would be a bit awkward, especially as he was, I think, pretty close to retirement. And General Kumara Mangalam was to succeed him. So it is better that if General Kumara Mangalam goes with you, because he will speak with equal authority on any matter and reflect the views of the army. If, on the other hand, he wants a second opinion, he can always ring me up. So I better remain here, and so Kumar Mangalam came with us. Now we went to Tashkent. Shastriji and Ayub used to meet alone together, whereas Mr. Bhutto and Sardar Saran Singh and I and the Chief Secretary of Pakistan, Aziz Ahmed, we used to meet in another room. We used to talk about other matters, such as trade had come to a stop, and that if we have a peace treaty or settlement, then how do we revive, restore things? And they said, well, we haven't come to talk of Tazarat. This is a serious matter. And well, I think, well, that's being discussed at the level of the heads of state and heads of government. Summit is going on, we won't talk about it. Shastri ji said that President Ayub said to him in so many words कि मैं आपसे दरखास्त करता हूँ कि आप मुझको इस बात पर मजबूर न करें कि मैं कहूँ कि हमने इसको मान लिया इंटरनेशनल बाउंड्री. अगर मैंने ये मंजूर किया तो मैं एक दिन भी वहाँ सर्वाइव नहीं कर सकूँगा, भुट्टो तो हमें खा जाएंगे. This is the position. Now what do I do? I, for my part, on the other hand, can't then accept that I am withdrawing the ceasefire line, and so we are again at where we were. In fact, he had made a broadcast. I had drafted that one, that we cannot go from ceasefire to ceasefire and wait till the Pakistanis have broken it. So we can't go back to another ceasefire. And so there was a total stalemate and a feeling that it's going to be a breakdown. Then Kosygin and his foreign minister Gromyko, who is now the president of the Soviet Union, came into the picture. And I must say that Gromyko's mastery over the facts, laws and everything was truly astounding. Now he produced the text of the old ceasefire agreement of 1948. And he said, now look, what is in this ceasefire line which is less sanctified than its international boundary? The respect to ceasefire line as defined in this agreement has all the elements of a full-fledged international boundary, except it's not called that. And are you going to quarrel over names, or are you going to accept the reality? And so, after a lot of toing and froing, after almost all hope was given of an agreement, and it was supposed to be the final day when we will part company without an agreement, a final phraseology was evolved, clumsy it may sound, but it implied what I was just referring to, namely both sides agreed to observe the ceasefire terms on the ceasefire line as faithfully as possible, something of that kind. Recounting the ceasefire terms as spelt in the original ceasefire agreement was one way of restating the sanctity which attaches to an international boundary, but without using the words international boundary in the process. And so, much to the surprise of everybody, the final meeting led to, well, we had a lunch together. I still have the menu of the lunch signed by all the participants, President Ayub, Kosygin, Lal Bahadur Shastri and others, when this whole thing was finally agreed to, and that we had the final ceremony when the Tashkent Declaration was read out and signed, speeches were made. And after that, the Russians had laid down a cultural program in which they had Pakistani ghazals, Bharatnatyam and all performed by Russian artists, but they had obviously rehearsed for it in anticipation of this for quite some time. It was a beautiful program. We were sitting in the front row. I looked at Shastri ji. He was looking a little pale and weak. And Kosygin also looked at him, and he had the same feeling. So he said, Shastri ji, are you tired? Do you want to go and rest? He said, no, I'm feeling fine. But he wasn't fine, I could see that. But anyway, after the show was over, Ambassador Kohl, who was our ambassador in Moscow, and I, we went to brief the international press, and Shastri ji went to his bungalow. We were to leave the next morning for Kabul, and it had already been agreed that India and Pakistan would resume diplomatic relations. So the High Commissioner who was here and who had been recalled, it was also planned that he will come with us back to India to become the High Commissioner. Now, when we came back from the press conference, it was around 11 in the night, Tashkent time. We were to leave early in the morning, so we had to pack our baggage and leave it outside our rooms to be picked up at 4 in the morning. And while I was packing, the phone rang, And Shastri ji's PA rings me up to say Shastri ji की तबीयत खराब है और कहा कि आपको खबर कर दें. I suspected the worst. So I walked across to the room of Ambassador Cole and said, look, Shastri ji has sent word that he is ill, so it must be pretty serious, so get the best medical help and let's all go to his villa, which was about 200 meters away. So I woke up Sardar Swaran Singh, Mr. Chavan, and we all walked across to his place when we saw Dr. Chuk giving him the last breath, artificial respiration kiss of death. And there was just no hope. But the Russian doctors came, they were struggling for his life, so they wouldn't pronounce him dead till almost 2 a.m. Tashkent time. For 2 hours they struggled. Kosygin came, President Ayub came, we're all there. Then when finally it was announced that he's dead, I had to inform Delhi. We had a direct line. We pick up the phone and Delhi exchange answers. And this is where, on a moment of tragedy, you get some stupid comedy also. The Delhi exchange answered and I said, would you please put me on to the president? The girl says, president of what? President of India. Said, do you know the telephone number? I said, look, Rashtrapati Bhavan exchange is what should ring up. After a few seconds, she says, Rashtrapati Bhavan exchange does not answer. Then I said, look, try the number of Dr. Nagendra Singh, secretary to the president. He has a direct line. After a few seconds, she said that his line is off the hook. I said, try Mr. Guldari Lal Nanda, the home minister. Chaprasi answers and says, Huzur, hukum nahi hai unko uthane ka. 5 बजे सवेरे आप फोन कीजिए तब उनको मिला देंगे आपसे उसके पहले तो कोई भी बात हमको हुक्म नहीं उठाने का. General Kumar Mangalam said that my operation room boys are always there. I'll ring up that number. He gave the number. No response from operations room. Then LP Singh, Home Secretary, he said, let me ring up my wife. So he rang up his wife. Then she woke up her security men at the front of her house to go to Nandaji's house to wake up his security men who forced themselves in to wake him up to give him the news. That is how the official news reached the government of India. And then C.P. Srivastava, who was joint secretary with me in PM's office, he rang up the family to inform them of the tragic news. Next morning, the whole jubilation was over. We had a funeral procession from the Tashkent residence to the airport. The Russians had overnight put a black ribbon on every flag which had lined up the route, farewell. So to that, everyone with mourning sign had come. All the flags were half-mast. President Ayub himself carried the pallbearer along with me. And he said that my High Commissioner will still go on this plane if you agree, because this was one of the things agreed between him and me while he was alive. So we said, of course. And so we came back with Shastriji's dead body. Tashkent began as a very triumphant thing and ended as a tragedy. The only thing I would add here is that somehow what Shastriji had said came true, that I will not be the Prime Minister to break the news to the country. Well, I think that brings one major part of the historical portion to an end. I'll now again come or continue with the Indo-Pak theme, but transfer the scene to Washington, where I was ambassador when trouble started in what is now Bangladesh and what was then East Pakistan. And when the things began to come to a boil, there was a great deal of sympathy in America, public opinion, press, media, for the East Pakistanis as they were known. Later they began to be known as the Bengalis. And Henry Kissinger, who was himself a Jewish refugee from Germany into America, he was also very moved by the plight of the refugees and number of refugees coming in. And he was the first person, the first American, but also the first person to tell me that the birth of Bangladesh is inevitable. This was on 16th April 1971. I remember that precisely because it happened to be my birthday, and we had gone to a party, not for her birthday, but at the house of the Mrs. Catherine Graham, the writer of Washington Post, when he made this remark to me. And at that time, he and I had been fairly close. We were talking generally of improving Indo-American relations. Now, while at that point, even he seemed sympathetic, some of the American officers serving in Dhaka were recalled because they were sympathetic to the Bengalis. And the Nixon was very strongly pro-Pakistan, pro-Ayub. And Kissinger also had to take the line, not just because of Nixon's love for Pakistan, but because Pakistan was the intermediary in planning his visit to China. Now that for Kissinger was a matter of great importance, and therefore he was trying very hard to keep the Pakistanis happy, and also, as he told me later, to signal to the Chinese that United States stands by its allies. So he began very sharply to change his tune as things began to head for a crisis, and there was a sign that there might be actually a conflict between the two countries. In between, he embarked on a journey which was to take him to India and Pakistan and to Vietnam before that. And Kissinger and I had lunch together. I invited him to lunch. And he asked me at that lunch, LK, do you think on this journey I shall get a glimpse of the Himalayas? So I said, Henry, it's very easy. You are coming from Vietnam to Delhi. I suggest you touch down in Calcutta for refueling. Fly low over the refugee camps that will give you a first-hand view of the situation. Fly along the Himalayas to land to Delhi. So he said, no, schedule is too tight to allow this. I must find some other way of getting a glimpse of the Himalayas. And he told me later this was nearest he could come to telling me that he was going to fly over the Himalayas from Pakistan to Peking. So anyway, that visit took place, but nobody knew about it. A few months after that, he phoned me one afternoon. I was not there. I had a security officer who did not know much English. He took down a message for me कि एम्बेसडर साहब बहादुर के लिए डॉक्टर श्री किशन चंद का फोन आया था. Kishan Chand was Lieutenant Governor in Delhi. I thought he has come. So I called my social secretary. Said, Pat, this man is the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. He is here. This is his phone number. Please invite him over to lunch, dinner, drinks, whatever he likes. She looked at it and says, no. I think, what do you mean, no? This ain't his number. This is Dr. Kissinger's number. I think, oh God, thank God you cried it. So I rang back. Kissinger said that, well, where will you be tonight at 7:30 p.m.? I said, look, it's 3:30 now. Why do you want to know where? Because I want to talk to you at that time. He said, why can't you talk to me now? I said, no, it's something which I can't reveal or talk on the phone until 7:30 p.m. So I gave him the address of a friend whose place I was dining and said, I'll be there. At 7:30 there, the phone rang. I had told my friend that there'd be a call from Kissinger. They thought I was dropping name, but when they actually found a call from Kissinger, they were rather excited and startled. Then he told me that he has been to China. The president is going to announce it on the radio and television in an hour's time. That's why he couldn't tell me earlier, because he wanted to avoid any possible leak. And that he would want me to tell our Prime Minister that if she did not welcome this move, the USA will consider it to be an unfriendly act. Now, I was so surprised that we had always supported that China in Peking is the real China, People's Republic of China is the real China. So there could be no question of our resenting a diplomatic recognition by US of China. But they were so nervous about it because American opinion was not going to take it too kindly that they wanted India not to criticize them. Anyway, this was the message we sent, which I did. But thereafter, with China and USA coming closer together, the attitude of US on the Indo-Pak situation began to get harder and harder. Now, here I must interject another element. Why was Nixon so violently anti-Indian? Here again it brings out how little things influence history. When Richard Nixon as vice president lost in the election, now industrial licensing at that stage was a very smooth operation, and what is more, it was depoliticized. In other words, the decision was taken by the licensing committee, which consisted of secretaries of all the concerned ministries, as well as representatives of each of the state governments. So they could come and plead for their projects, why a project should go to one state rather than another, or why a project should be supported. And it was a collective judgment, and it was no longer a matter of going to the minister. In fact, it was in that phase very much of a fact and working method that while policy guidance was being given by ministers in day-to-day administration, it was the administrator functioning, and a vast range of decisions were taken by undersecretaries and deputy secretaries. And practically most decisions were taken by joint secretaries. Secretaries themselves were relatively free from it. They were again on the policy plane thinking of instrumentalities. And ministers were, of course, with them in that process. The minutes of the licensing committee used to go to the minister, but it was the minutes of the licensing committee which they could not change. Now, technically, they had the power to override the licensing committee's decision. Technically, in the sense that if they wanted to and they said so, there was nothing in the law to prevent that happening. But the tradition was very firm that licensing committee's decision was never interfered with by political levels. And this, I think, was a general point applicable throughout the administrative system. For example, it is known that on many issues there were differences between the top leaders. Sardar Patel and Pandit Nehru, for example, were known to have differences on many issues. Now, there was only 2 or 3 ways in which they were dealt with. One was that the minister in charge could take a decision within his own sphere of responsibility. 2, the matter could come to the cabinet for discussion. These were the 2 formal methods, a cabinet decision or a decision within the ministry. But otherwise, there was a political process also. Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru would meet together, and at times they would say, well, let's talk to Gandhiji about it. This was for a very short spell while he was still alive, but his influence and personality was also a counting factor. Similarly, take an issue like decontrol of food grain prices. After World War II, the prices were controlled, and a view was propounded that prices should be decontrolled, and Mahatma Gandhi took the line that, look, we can't control food, a basic need of the people, by law and by governmental authority. Wartime was different, foreign route was different, but today, let this be free, and if people die, well, it is a social responsibility, but government should not jump into this as a policeman. It's not a police matter. The social conscience of people should see to it that nobody starves. When the question came to the cabinet for consideration, Vishnu Sahai was the food secretary. He was totally opposed to decontrol. Dr. Rajendra Prasad was the food minister. He was for decontrol. Now today the tradition is that a paper to the cabinet goes with the approval of the minister, which means the minister's view goes. Rajendra Prasad said, no, the cabinet must hear my secretary's viewpoint, which is different from mine, and then take a decision. And so Vishnu Sahai in the cabinet presented the case against his own minister. Pandit Nehru, who believed in controls much more, supported the secretary. Sardar Patel was not control-minded, so he supported Rajendra Prasad. And every time Gandhiji's name used to come up, that Gandhiji favors decontrol. And this is a story which I got first hand, but I was not present in the cabinet meeting, so I cannot vouch for its 100% accuracy. That when numbers were being counted, it was an evenly balanced situation. And then the last person was Maulana Azad. And when Pandit Nehru turned to him and said, Maulana Sahab, aapki kya raay hai? The Maulana was dozing. So he woke up and he said, Jo Rajendra Prasad ji karte hain, main yuhi raay. So people say it is not quite clear whether Maulana Azad had applied his mind to it, but he took the line of least resistance. The food matter, the food minister says this, I agree with him. So that's how food came to be decontrolled at that critical point of time. But then, again, looking back a little at industrial licensing, I spoke of how well it worked. Later, it didn't work too well, and I'll come to that after a few moments. But one point which in retrospect strikes me is that the industrial licensing technique was an offshoot of Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Because there, regulation is done by banning a certain range of activities, not to prevent all of them, but to permit the desirable ones and weed out the undesirable ones. So the formulation of Industries Act was also this, that you cannot create capacity in these industries without getting a license. Now you are dying to create capacity in industries, you are wanting to industrialize, but the technique followed is to put a ban on your creating capacity and then saying that you apply and we shall give a license. Now a license or a permit, or call it what, authorization, this is a straight derivation from the police administration of Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code, which no one quite realized, which was the subconscious of the administrator who was giving shape to traditions of a law and order society to economic administration. Now, what was the weakness in this? The weakness was that you could, if 10 people are wanting to do a thing, decide who will do it. But if nobody is wanting to do something which is desirable, then you may waive your license. It doesn't create anything. In other words, you can pull with a string, but you can't push with it. And control is just like that. It's a string. So the string is useful when you have got enough fervor and a climate for development. But if there is a slack, then there is no stimulus. Then you can have your licensing shop open, but nobody comes to take a license for industries where you want extra capacity. Now this thought did not bother anyone, not even, certainly not me at that time. But then we entered a new phase. What happened was that because of the liberal licensing of industries, imports of industrial machinery began to shoot up, and our foreign exchange reserves began to decline to dangerously low levels. At that point, when a stock was taken of orders already placed abroad, then we said, my God, this in another 2 years, we shall have depleted all our sterling balances, have no reserves left, and will not be in any position to meet all the claims on us. So we shall in fact be broke and a defaulter, and I think this whole world will laugh at us that within 10 years of freedom, you have become bankrupt. So 3 decisions were taken. One was to apply exchange control in a very tight way. Import licensing was tightened. Travel restrictions were imposed. Any foreign collaboration which industry had, which meant payment for royalties or anything else, came under strict scrutiny. And even investment proposals, which the licensing committee approved because it's a desirable investment, it's in accordance with the plan, would not get the final clearance to proceed until it was re-examined from the foreign exchange angle to see what its implications were, what capital goods would need to be imported, how will they be paid for, do you have credits, do you have any other means, and so on. So this process of examination came in. It followed industrial licensing and began to take twice as long as industrial licensing did. The second effect of the exchange crisis was that India began to mobilize external aid. We went to the World Bank and said, this is our difficulty. The World Bank had been lending to India. So the World Bank organized a consortium of countries where India had placed orders for plant and machinery and told them that, look, gentlemen, your orders will have to be cancelled unless you give India credit. So at that point of time, export credit was made available by most countries. I must add here that the Canadians joined the consortium out of sheer goodwill. They didn't have much orders from India, but they said we must help India. So they came and offered credits, not because their own machinery orders were at stake, but out of sheer desire to help India. And a third decision was taken that we must build our own machines so that our development was not at the mercy of external assistance being available. So heavy machinery industries began to receive emphasis, both in the second and even more in the third plan. Then we enter a new phase. In the mid-60s, Pandit Nehru was dead. There was inflation in the country, and we had successive droughts, and we had to import huge quantities of food grain, mostly under PL 480, and we were dependent on United States for the shipments, and we were criticizing the United States' involvement in Vietnam in no uncertain terms. So it was this kind of a situation which began to create major problems and tensions. First of all, Shastri ji decided that we must have much greater emphasis on agriculture than on industry. He, being a farmer by background, felt there had already been some distortion, but this import situation and drought situation made it all the more necessary to do so. And he asked Subramaniam, C. Subramaniam, who was a very capable minister, to take on the agriculture portfolio, giving up, if I remember correctly, either steel or heavy industry, which he had. People thought he had been demoted because in popular judgment, agriculture was looked upon as an inferior ministry. But Subramaniam said that either I'll break the problem or the problem will break me. He took it on as a challenge. And then when Shastriji came to power, I had become his secretary. So he asked me to head a committee on food grain prices and supplies. And it was from that committee that we recommended that we are following the wrong policy by keeping food grain prices down, which means the farmer has no incentive to produce more. And whenever he has a bumper crop, his prices drop so much that he becomes poorer as a result. So we must give support prices. Now, one of the interesting sidelights on support prices, I had to, of course, to talk to the state governments to persuade them to accept this philosophy and also to settle what the price should be for the food grains. Now, these food surplus states generally welcomed a high price because it meant prosperity to them. The states which were short of food began to say, but our import price of food will go up too much. They were reluctant. But Madhya Pradesh, which had a surplus of rice, began to oppose the price rise on the ground that how will the poor in our state be able to afford the rice? So I tried to explain to them that, look, we want more production, it's a countrywide effort. But what ultimately changed their viewpoint was when I pointed out that Maharashtra had accepted a higher price for rice, and if they did not accept it, all Madhya Pradesh rice will get smuggled into Maharashtra to get the higher price. So they accepted it almost under duress. And that began the process of higher prices for grain.